friends of the library for making our programming available or possible, and for all the colleagues who keep the lights on, and for all of you for continuing to support us. Today's speaker, Nick Licata, comes from Seattle, and if anyone read against Billingham, I don't know how that happened, but he's from Seattle. And my apologies to Nick for that. He's from a working class family. He's the first one who attended college. And he led a local chapter of Students for Democratic Society at Bowling Green State University, which is where my grandmother-in-law worked. Yes, married the Pugnate, and she's in the administration. He was subsequently elected to student body president, and he became a Seattle City Council member despite being significantly outspent. And the majority of the council, the mayor, and both daily newspapers supporting his opponent. He was elected to 5 terms to the council and became its president. In 2012, he was named by the nation as Progressive Municipal Officer of the Year and twice named Best Local Politician by Seattle Weekly. He's an acknowledged leader in passing paid sick and safe leave, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and legalizing marijuana. He initiated the founding of Local Progress, the National Municipal Policy Network, and served as its first chairman. And in 2003, he authored the children's novel, Princess Bianca and the Vandals. Were you talking about that? Oh,
no,
okay,
it is a children's book.
Gotcha. And let me admit someone else to the room. And so with that, I am going to pass this over to Nick. I'm going to put you on camera. Boom, there you are. And take it away.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thank you for being here. I appreciate the opportunity. Like I said, I'll probably talk for a half hour and then we'll open up Q&A, or actually anytime while I'm talking, I'm very sort of open-ended. You have a question or a comment, just raise your hand, I'll recognize you. So I'm not offended. I think that's a great idea to have some interaction as well, particularly a small group like this. As I was going to say, the origin of this book, which is called Student Power, Democracy, Revolution in the 60s, is I attended college in the 60s, from 65 to 69. So in some ways that was sort of like the heyday of the 60s, or late 60s, and of course early 70s. And while I was there, and the book talks about, it's partly a narrative of what my experiences were, but it's also partly an analysis of why things happened, but also what role students played. And it's a bit of history as well. And I weave in the analysis and the history also with the understanding that this was a real major cultural revolution in the United States at that time, which has really impacted, I believe, the development of this country in so many ways. We never really think about it. And student power itself was a movement, but it was, in some ways, it was the genesis, or I would say it was the handmaiden to many of the more prominent national movements, certainly civil rights and the anti-war, eventually women's rights, and the environmental movement. And the genesis of a lot of those came out of students who had the time and energy and were motivated to start questioning what was around them. And I'm going to go into that in just a moment. But the book resulted from, while I was in college, I collected and cut out all kinds of articles that I was at in Bowling Green State University, which is a very conservative college, public college, 10,000 students, most of them drawn from Ohio. For those involved in politics, it's a purple state, sometimes red, sometimes blue. But the student body there, in some ways, was much more what I'd call working class. That's sort of a strange term, but middle class. But there were people who were not going to the Ivy League schools. They were not even going to the bigger public schools. They were there to get into college, and many of them were first-generation college students. And I was first-generation college students, but actually, strange enough, I was a first-generation high school graduate. Well, neither of my parents graduated from high school. So for me, it was a really huge step. But I cut off the articles, I saved them for a period of 10 years or so after I graduated. And after I had been an insurance broker, I decided to put them together, and that story emerged out of that. And then I wrote this book, and eventually I just went on to write other things. It was a book that your library has here, and I talked about called Becoming a Citizen Activist. And it talks about the mechanisms one needs to make political change and how to be progressive, but also pragmatic. Excuse me. Yeah, and that's about life. And this is in some ways goes back to my own genesis of why is it someone who came from a very conservative family, went to a very conservative college, who was so conservative in 1968 when Nixon ran and won. They did most people forget, Nixon only won by 1% of the popular vote. Humphrey came that close. On our campus, and I have the numbers in here, it was something like close to 70% of the students supported Nixon, and Humphrey was in the low digits. And the most amazing thing is that the leader of the American Nazi Party, Rockwell, Lincoln, I think it was Lincoln Rockwell, showed up on campus, and he's invited in an auditorium. 3,000 people showed up, half of them were townspeople, the other half were students. There were literally almost no protests because you couldn't almost, the environment was very closed. And his theme, unfortunately, we hear it today. It's not in the same context, but the theme was that white people are the oppressed, and they are the ones that need to take back our country. And it's a theme that has been even before then, and unfortunately, we sort of hear it now. So I want to say about the book, and if we have time, I'd like to read just a few small sections to give a sense of it. But one of the things I point out to is that the big issues then are the same ones today, but they're somewhat couched differently. For instance, so interesting thing about civil rights then is now we see as systemic racism. It's been moved from individual to like what's the institutional problem. Freedom of speech, and I have examples here, is passing out literature, flyers that might have a profanity on it. Or freedom of speech was one student used the word, he was very popular, I think I have this in here. He was a black student. Our campus only had 4/5% of black students. And at a major student council meeting, he was on a student council, the student council consisted of 47 students, all of whom were white except him. And after that year, they all became white. So it was an environment that wasn't explicitly, the term we use now is racist or discriminatory, but it existed. And when I bring this back to the freedom of speech, there was a meeting where people were protesting social conditions on campus, very conservative campus, but even then the students felt restrained. And he stood up and said, we all feel constrained by these social rules and regulations, but some of us are even more restrained than constrained. And people was yeah. It's discrimination. A simple word, discrimination, had never really been spoken on campus in a public spot by a black. So this made the front page of our college newspaper. So you have to go back in time to realize where this nation actually was. And then the freedom of expression, and then in those days was something as simple as perhaps gathering on campus and having open mics and having the formation of what free universities, which eventually became of, having classes outside. But freedom of expression now is sometimes seen as not wearing a mask during the middle of a deadly pandemic. So these terms, sometimes the concept is right and just, but they are somehow transformed. And what I found was that the attitude of questioning authority, whether it's liberals or conservatives, in some ways it can be a good thing. It gets people to think. But what ends up, I think, not just hurting progress, but ultimately weakening our democracy, is that it happens when the group or groups become so passionate that they think they finally have reached not just the best solution, but the only solution. And that's where it crosses the line into all of a sudden drifting into an undemocratic movement, and one that actually hurts the very causes it started with. And I want to read a couple of sections of that with firsthand experiences that I saw. I want to say that when we talk about the students having done a lot in those areas, it's interesting to note that the Vietnam War was pushed initially by students. SNCC, which was initially both whites and blacks, and eventually became, due to the leadership of SNCC deciding that they wanted to focus on the black community, and the whites were invited to lead, and they didn't, not under duress, recognizing they wanted to organize in white communities. But that was a student organization that worked with SDS and created a 25,000 person demonstration in Washington, D.C. at one time. Also, students are the first ones that initiated the movement, a successful movement, of having studies, ethnic studies. There were no real ethnic studies in college. It started off as black studies, actually. And an interesting part is that the movement for black studies swept across the country within a very short period of time. It went about 2 years. But the movement to have women's studies and then centers for women's studies was a lag of another 5 years before that caught up, basically. But all of it started in the formation or the activity of students at colleges. And I go at the end of the book where I do more analysis. Why did it happen then and not before? Why is it that SDS ended up with having the largest student organization? It wasn't anything that's wrong or big as that. Because when you look at the numbers, more students went to college than ever before. And most of them came from families that were not college educated. Up until then, it was college educated students. And it was, it was elite, but not in the pejorative sense, but it was a smaller group. But land grant colleges, which had existed, but were expanded, community colleges did not exist in the early 60s. They only came into being in the late 60s, which even made it broader. But the protest began before the community colleges, and the student movement, and the protests, and the activity. And it wasn't just that there were more students. That's interesting. I don't think many people have really looked at. My background, by the way, I have a master's in sociology, so I'm always interested in social dynamics. Is that this is the first time that a large mass of young people were living together outside the home. So they had the natural ability to gather and talk amongst themselves. And of course, sports and drinking and all those things were the main focus. But still, a significant portion of them did become involved in politics and started questioning even the politics of where they were, the university, which is how I got involved. Questioning, why is it that we're an institution that controls, for women in particular, they had to sign out if they left the dormitory, and they wanted to make sure that they were back by midnight. And if some weren't, they could be suspended. And I knew people who were. There was a booklet given out to women. This is a public school, 10,000. It was probably similar to other large public institutions that said this is put up by the Women's Association, which is one of the young college women, of course, the dean of women, which they no longer have, and the dean of men, which we no longer have. The dean of women ran it. And in that booklet, it was the do's and don'ts of how to be a good woman student. There was no such booklet for men. That's so interesting. It's like, it was this sort of mentality of literally dividing by gender rights. And yet, by the end of the 60s, all that was abolished. But the initial students, this is the thing I was pushing, the initial people who begin any movement are in some ways, and they may not go on to be the leaders, but they are the leader in the sense that they crack open the door. And that's the hardest movement to make. The initial crack, the initial movement. And then others can flow through, and others will begin better organizers, or better articulators, or just being more attractive. Yes.
Nick, what part do you think the anti-Vietnam War movement brought together students? That's my experience. I was part of that. Maybe
It was a major movement, and in many ways it was the main one. As you may recall, in 65, 66 was towards LBJ's last year of his term. Before then, you were exempt from being drafted if you're in college. And then LBJ changed the rules. I don't think it was Congress, I think it was the executive order that said, after this year, you can stay in college, but you would be drafted once you graduate from college. And that made a major difference on campuses like where I went, where you had, by far, the majority of men were conservative and women. And all of a sudden, and they were supportive of the war like we all were, quite honestly, because there was this weak little country, well, initially, weak little country, and it was being invaded, and we were going to help that little country. You know, that initial support dwindled away across the board, but particularly among students. But the anti-war movement was certainly initiated by American friends and people who saw children being napalmed, and the kind of repugnancy we have right now with what Russia is doing in Ukraine, except it was multiplied even many more times. There were our soldiers doing that type of work. And the large demonstration I may mention of, I think I might read a portion of it, was organized by students opposing the war. The war I would say, overshadowed the civil rights movement as far as sheer number of middle class, working class white students for sure. But even among black students, the war, because many of the students being drafted were black. And so they had a real interest in it. And then they had their iconic heroes like Cassius Clay, which became Muhammad Ali. And I think I even mentioned him in the book. I do. They broke the mold. They said, wait a second, what's going on here? Why is it me? And why are we over there? And those are the initial questions. We set up a table, an anti-war table on our campus. And the inflammatory literature we had were from the Quakers, American Friends. And the language was as simple as, why are we there? Is this a good idea? You know, it's like really simple, basic stuff. And the first table that was set up was surrounded by, you know, we call them jocks, but they were, you know, college students. Maybe some were townies, people who lived in Bowling Green. Surrounded the table, and they tipped it over after yelling them, and you know, and scattering the literature around. And you know, we came back and put up another table, and then the police said, well, because of fire regulations, they had to be so far away, which I'm sure that was phony. But the initial, violence is a hard word to use, you're exaggerating, but the initial physical obstruction of another person's freedom of movement was against the students who were generally silently, passively standing outside protesting the war of some sort. And there were multiple incidents on our campus and other campuses as well. So the war by far was the motivator. But what it did was, falling into the theme, it questioned, is this a good policy? And who's benefiting from it? And that began to seep into the civil rights. Why is it that on campus, there's almost no Black students? So why is it that women all of a sudden have a handbook and the men don't, and so the war was more than just stopping an invasion of a country. It was taking a look at who's calling the shots in the larger sense of the word. Would you mind if I read a couple sections that talk about my initial experience and get a sense of what it was like? Are people familiar at all with Students for Democratic Society? Okay, so this goes to how I got involved. Before going to college, I shined shoes on Saturdays at my dad's barbershop, which is just my first job ever. And he didn't have any customers, so that means I didn't either. Between customers, I would read a stack of right-wing John Birch Society pamphlets, because my father had a lot of working class people who were very involved in John Birch Society, which still I think may exist. And some of the customers would leave them behind, so we'd read them. And I was always intrigued by the communist conspiracy they were fighting. So I sought a copy of the Communist Party Daily Worker, because I want to see who are these people. So I tracked down one in a small downtown store. And both the Birchers and the communists were fighting some unseen cabal that secretly ran the country and wanted to control it. It spoke of democracy as an exercise as every citizen life should be able to do. So I said, well, what's going on here? So our Seattle chapter had sponsored, found a faculty sponsor, and to receive recognition as a responsible student organization, we had to be approved. And this is the first instance I got personal experience of being less of a scaremongering. We were quickly accused of being part of a grand conspiracy, much like the ones that had written in the John Birch and Communist papers. The accusation alone gave our organization the stigma of being unpatriotic. I began to understand how anyone could be socially ostracized or even jailed if others accused them of being something if they were in fact not. The BG News, the local news, college newspaper, ran an editorial quoting the aging and influential FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. He described SDS as a youth group with active communist infiltration. And the previous year, the National SDS, along with SNCC, sponsored an anti-war march to Rio. So that was in 65. In DC, this alliance between the most extensive white and black student organizations in the nation that successfully attracted an estimated 25,000 participants, make it the first large demonstration against the war. So the students that started the first large. And the FBI warned that the numerous Communist Party members were involved in the demonstration. I couldn't believe that by holding an outdoor demonstration against the war and communists showing up, that the authorities would conclude that all of them were communists. Of course, no one could tell precisely who was a communist, so everyone was subject to suspicion, and that included Reverend Martin Luther King, the first prominent civil rights leader to criticize the war. And what's interesting, the NAACP actually opposed him on that issue. Hoover sent a note to President Johnson saying, based on King's recent activities and public utterances, it is clear he is an instrument in the hands of subversive forces seeking to undermine our nation. So in that atmosphere of paranoia, the BG News concluded the SDS had socialist leanings. It could be saddled with a communist label after reviewing the FBI releases and other government material. And so their response was, this group of 5 or 6 of us, they challenged us to prove the red label was untrue. So again, guilty until you prove innocence. And that was the mentality then, and sometimes even now when you think about what's going on, is that you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. I want to read another section here that I was always curious about because of my upbringing and reading about John Birch material, and many of the people I grew up with would be now considered Trump supporters. So I came out of that background. What was it like for these the people that I had grown up with, but were not in college for the most part? There was some. And during the '68 election, a lot of people forget the left wing, from Democrats or through the law, actually ran two different campaigns for president. One was headed by Eldridge Cleaver, who was Black Panther. The other was Dick Gregory, who was an anti-war activist and a well-known comedian. And they got minuscule votes on a national level as presidential candidates. However, the same was not true with the right. They found their leader in former Alabama Governor George Wallace. In the spring of '68, he had his state troopers beat and tear gas civil rights groups to halt their peaceful march. Later, the nation would watch him try to physically stop two Black students from enrolling in the University of Alabama until federal marshals escorted them in. Wallace was a populist, appealing to those who supported segregation and thought wealthy liberal elites ran the country in both parties. Wallace said, "There's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrat and the Republican parties." And people would just say, yeah, that's true. So that spring, my junior year, I saw Wallace give a campaign speech in Toledo, Ohio, high school gym. I heard he was doing it. I drove up with my friends. He was running for president as an independent. Working class people packed the bleachers. They were familiar folks. I grew up with them. There wasn't a suit or tie among them. The men had trim haircuts. They wore neat, casual clothing. The women dressed mostly modestly, no short skirts, no jeans. His audience was not a college-age crowd, although there were some youths present. I thought their ordinary attire belied the anger seething within them. I'd never seen a political rally with so much energy, including the anti-war ones. The crowd began to stamp their feet like a marching band in anticipation of Wallace's arrival. It grew only louder with time. Finally, Wallace appeared, walked onto stage. The crowds rose to its feet and clapped a mighty roar. He's there, seeing this emerge. It was as if a maestro had appeared in front of an orchestra. He stepped up to the podium and then proceeded to whip them into an ever higher pitch of anger at everything that was wrong with the country, from pampered college students whiting the streets to Black welfare dads refusing to work. And a handful of us sat high in the last row, quietly intimidated, and a dozen Black students stood on in front of the main floor, right below Wallace's platform, and they were objecting to his racist remarks. And Wallace snarled, and he pointed them as if they were like many-made props to focus the white crowd's hate. And united against the common enemy, the audience capitulated insults upon them. And I feared for their safety, but they weren't physically harmed. That was probably fine with Wallace, as he needed them as a foil, not victims. And that was an experience that I remembered. And then later I went to a rally, a large march with Martin Luther King, period. And the difference was night and day. It was enthusiasm, certainly, but there wasn't anger. And he spoke of peace, and he spoke of justice, and even of love. It was an instance that made me realize that there could be a future that is positive and not negative. I'm open to questions. If you have questions. Yes.
Well, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm curious because you said you graduated in '69.
Yes.
Before or after SDS imploded at the conference when the Weather Underground took over? I'm curious as to what your response to that was.
I was there just about when it happened. I was at the second to the last National Assembly, and it was taken over. Actually, there was a group called Progressive Labor, which was a monolith group, and the meeting I went to, can I read just a small section that directly addresses this? The SDS National Council meeting hall was filled with students debating various paths to revolutionary change. So I walk in. It was held in Ann Arbor. I felt like a country bumpkin, spent my summers sorting tomatoes and I got my pay for college, rather than organizing factory workers to overthrow the system. I was wondering, were there others there like me? That evening, I searched for individuals who questioned the revolutionary approach. Well, this is an experience with anarchists, and I met some people who were Trotskyites, Young Socialist Alliance, and they asked me if I wanted to spend the evening talking about the difference between collegiate cultural nationalism as opposed to organizing workers. And I said, no, I don't think so. And the living room was packed with students, most were on their feet with clenched fists, stomping their feet, saying power to the people. And I have the bearded guy, this is true, suddenly grabbed the TV set, raised it high above his head, as if to throw it down. And just as he was about to, a frantic voice said, stop. And with the TV still raised high, the crowd responded in unison. Property is theft. The anarchist holding the TV yelled up at the long-haired person on the steps. Private property must be abolished. The resident, who I assumed was invested in keeping the TV in one piece, retorted quickly, schooled in debating the merits of communism over anarchy. He said, but this is personal property, not private property. And defeated the bearded guy to place the TV back on the table. There is no difference, and then went on to debate the rest of the evening. But PL, the British Labour, was creating more and more influence in SDS. And although they were small, they were very tightly organized, and they had a very powerful way of presenting their message. And to counter the PL's growing influence, the national secretary at that time, Mike Klonsky, who went on to form the Revolutionary Youth Movement, and they splintered off, and some of the women came from them through multiple splinter groups. But at that time, during this meeting, it was RIM versus the PL. And RIM believed that youth was the revolutionary factor that would make the revolution come, and PL was the working class. And both of them considered themselves to be vanguards. So the result was the bulk of the National Council's meetings was devoted to fiercely debating who was more essential, youth or workers. And as the National Council for that weekend was wrapping up, was standing in it, the hall divided down the middle aisle, literally, with RIM supporters on one side chanting ho, 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 che, min, and the other PL side with PL members chanting Mao, 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 say son. And that's how the meeting ended. And I basically went on to wonder, is anyone outside this room, particularly the thousands and thousands of members of SDS, aware of what's going on here? And the following meme is when you said the Weatherman.
It wasn't the Weatherman yet.
But it was Bernice Dorn, and Mike Klonsky, and also I forgot, he's a school teacher now up in Chicago.
Yeah, I forget his name.
Yeah, in any case, PL actually won the vote, and this is the funny part, is that the folks who lost it, RIM, claimed that the election was stolen, and therefore they walked out, and they had been in charge of the national office, and they took all the books with them, that's the accounting books, the list of the names, and PL, they won the election, and as they were a minority group, they just happened to win that particular vote count, took over the shell of SDS, and within 6 months, it was no longer in existence, it's just the shell itself. But the student movement, MOB, for instance, some people were involved in MOB and other organizations, continued to exist. But with the core student power movement, which was SDS, broken apart, all those people actually, in some ways, were like seeds spread into a garden. They all became involved in many, many other ways. It's the fact that the women's movement, the environmental movement, the gay movement, which were never at the core of the student power movement, but they had their genesis. They were there, but they never had been, shall we say, received any nutrition. And I think all these students that were no longer caught up in this ideology battle, went out there and started getting involved in it. So that's where the ironic twist is that even though SDS imploded, it probably helped the growth of these other organizations. So
It's interesting, it's almost like what happened with Occupy.
with,
Occupy.
oh, yes, no, exactly. And I talk a little bit about Occupy in my other book, of becoming a citizen activist, because that's another interesting example of what went on. Yes.
As I recall, Bowling Green's not too far from Kent State.
Well, it's,
And,
yeah,
to me, a lot of the air went out of the room after May of 1970, when it became clear that they would shoot at us
yes.
and the president would condone it. Do you have any reflections on that?
Well, I mean, I was in Berkeley at that time, actually. So Berkeley was, as you can imagine, erupted, as many places did around the country. And it was a National Guard that basically, just aimed the rifles at the students and just shot away at them. And then I wasn't at Bowling Green at that time, but for the first time ever, students did, I think, occupy the administration building for several hours. And blacks were in the lead for that too. This is one of those
I
instances.
mean, I
where-
think there was an immediate uproar against it, but then it died out by the next fall or so. I was in transit from Cambridge to Palo Alto, so I
Yeah,
have no way of really comparing one community
right.
and another.
Right. Well, it did ebb. You're right. It peaked and ebbed. And part of that I think is due to a lot of people just depressed and dropping out. And then also I think getting involved in other issues as well was also part of it. I actually was at Kent the year before as I didn't drop out of SDS, but I was a student body president, and we had a core of people on our council, not the majority, but who were who we call these days progressives or social democrats, whatever. And we went to Kent to talk to the SDS chapter there, find out what they were up to, and talk to student journals. And they were much more doctrinaire than Bowling Green was. And they were much more into, in fact, the white SDS members were much more, I don't say dogmatic, but rigid in their beliefs of the principles. And the black students, who were just as progressive, just as radical, they had more to lose. They were a small group on campus. They came from as a whole, not as well situated economically, and their goals were more immediate, and the white students' goals were more, shall we say, not utopianistic, but out there, okay, and more willing to take risks. And I think their socioeconomic allowed more of a social network for safety. So the black students there actually split from the white SDS. They didn't oppose them, but they weren't going to be like fellow travelers, be there for SDS's events. And that incident where the students were shot, by that time SDS was not the powerhouse it had been. There were diffuse groups of active students. So, and that was really much more of a spontaneous event. And I did mention one of the reasons that SDS grew so strongly and so expanded is because of the lack of ideology. They had a direction, and it was actually centered on the initial document was referred to as the Port-Huron Statement, officially. It was really based on this concept of participatory democracy, which appealed to me and appealed to a lot of people who I would say were most concerned with achieving change, getting power, but doing it in a way that was within the context of a democracy as opposed to within the context of a revolutionary spirit.
In my own perception, and maybe I was moving that way myself, is that it moved more into environmentalism, feminism in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So there seemed to be a real break in May 1970 between a more strident anti-war any more acceptable.
Well, I think the break occurred beforehand, but I think that was the apex of it, because it was very, very clear. And a number of, as you may know, the Weathermen went on to, one I've talked about, one who I met, and was a regional organizer in Ohio, I think Terry from his last name. Blew himself up.
And some went into, religions, and some went
Oh,
into
yes.
communes and everything.
Yes. Well, communes actually, I think, were in many ways a positive development, and co-housing, which,
Yeah.
developed out of that. And the whole sense of community and the Esalen Institute. I mean, it really also involved, I think, and that's why I think it's a cultural revolution. I think it also involved people looking inward too, not in the mood of desperation, but in the mood of thinking about things, being more thoughtful and exploring things, and being more experimental. That was the other thing too. Allowed people to be more experimental. I had fun writing this book because I don't know if you can probably pick it up, but there's a sense of humor in the 60s that we sometimes, when we think back on it, we tend to emphasize the writing, we tend to emphasize the intensity. And if you look at the books written about the 60s, I can make a bet with you right now that I win. Most of the books have to do with the Lebanon, or the Black Panthers, pretty much the groups that were the most outrageous. And that's how media works, right? I mean, that's how we all work. We're most curious by those who are doing something dramatic, and not necessarily that we agree with, but we're in shock, right? So we're drawn to it. But this is almost a counterpoint or a counterbeat. It's talking about just normal people and how they were brought together, not to take over the country, but how to take over their own lives and have more control over their lives. And the tremendous hostility that they faced and opposition and what they had to go through to just make those initial gains. And I have good news, by the way. I hope to be able to announce in the next 6 weeks that your library has one of these, but unfortunately, I would encourage people to go out and buy this book, but here's the problem. It's $100. So, but the publisher is an academic publisher, and I understand that their audience is professors and academic universities, but it looks like they're going to do a paperback, which means you dramatically lower the cost. And as soon as that comes out, I'll be letting the world know. And also it'll come out as a Kindle, which means it'll be an ebook format. So it'll be accessible. And it's, I encourage you, it's a fun read, but it's really insightful. Yes.
Just going back to the participatory democracy and what your own statement.
Yeah.
By the time your chapter was started.
Yeah.
How was that idea of participatory democracy being put into practice locally? Did you guys go as far as to try to not have any hierarchy in the organization? Was there consensus decision making? What was the internal organization of your group like?
Yes. And our group is actually formed and ceased. So it would have been in the fall of '66. So it was still rather early. I mean, there were a dozen other campuses, maybe 2 dozen. Eventually, there were like I think 200 or 300 around the country. And ours was, in fact, pointed out by some of the. I've read other books, obviously, on the '60s. Bowling Green does get mentioned on occasion as one of the most conservative campuses. They had one of the most, I would say, social democratic chapters, as opposed to action faction type chapter. But to answer your question, we were so democratic that we never had ideological debates. It was basically, what do we do to push forward the example of stopping the war, or getting rights, having some control on the campus. But the national did come to us, and they wanted all the chapters, and most of the chapters didn't do this, to basically either sit in or physically obstruct the recruiters coming in routes of recruiters. And our chapter, and ours is a real SDS chapter, had a meeting about whether we were gonna go in and instruct the recruiters. I remember cut off this thing where the newspaper went back and asked, I was no longer head of the SDS, I was there for a while, but this time I was, I think, student government. Asked them, well, what are you gonna do? And they said, well, we have to decide, we have to, we're gonna have a meeting and we're gonna decide what to do. And what they decided to do actually was pass out flyers. And then when I went to a national council, and I traveled a lot, visiting SDS chapters on my own. It turns out that most chapters did what we did. So the dozen or so universities that did obstruct the routes of recruiters received all the attention, which makes sense, right? Because they're the ones that the police are gonna be called in, and that's a newspaper. But all the others that basically were still opposed to them and were doing non-confrontational, but in the sense that they were passing out literature and talking to students and trying to do something, that's the path that most of the students followed. And as a rule, this is my rule, but I think it probably works, is that most movements have a core that are going to be at the front. And then the second level are people who are watching that core, who are within hearing distance, but they're not going to be in the front line. And then furthest away are the people who are either ignoring it or it's catching their attention and they're sort of curious about it. And that's pretty much how SDS works. It's the thousands of students that were involved with it. But like I said, it was open-ended. SDS, to its credit, would work with anyone. Literally. They wouldn't work with people who didn't agree with them, but they work with students who both opposed war or favored civil rights, didn't have to go through a litmus test, whether they, believed in a class struggle.
I have a question from Bruce Benton. Surprisingly, the radical left student movement began with Tom Hayden at the U of Michigan. Why in the more conservative Midwest rather than on the East Coast?
It may have begun with him because I'm not sure I would agree with that, but there were a number of other, Paul Booth and others were from the East Coast, I think, who were very involved in the creation of SDS.
Gitlin.
Pardon?
Gitlin.
Gitlin, yeah, who's a professor now, but in any case.
Yeah.
I would say that the Midwest actually, in some ways, makes more sense. The East Coast had the more radical chapters. They're more intellectual. They're more steeped in the leftist literature. The Midwest had actually, in some ways, more people involved in the action faction. They weren't as steeped into the ideology, but they wanted to see change. In some ways, the Midwest had a very strong populist base, unlike the East, which was more of an intellectual base. So the Midwest populist base, which we sometimes immediately identify populism with right wing, but populism can be either. And in this instance, it was, I would say, progressive populism. So that's, I think, one of the reasons we see it coming out of the Midwest. And I'm gonna have to wrap this up pretty soon. So
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left.
yeah, I'm gonna rush down to the ferry. But yes.
I would just like to say that let's not forget about the music.
Oh, I do talk about music here. Canned Heat, one of my favorite bands of all times. I went to Woodstock, and I have a great story in there.
Yeah.
That basically, it's not the kind of Woodstock story most people talk about. I mean, I did mention a number of things, but I always add politics to it. And one of the high points for me was when we got there early. The 5 of us drove all the way. We, like most students who showed up or youth, forgot to bring food. So, because we're heading to the concert, and I had just finished a 30-day solo hitchhiking trip around the East Coast. So, and the people I came with had a free pass because we were supposedly reporters from the college newspaper. In any case, I left the car, I was looking around for a place to crash because 5 of us couldn't sleep in the car, and I saw a tent. and the tent had stacks and stacks of newspapers on it. And I thought, this would be great, I could sleep on the stack of newspapers, no one around. And I thought, what kind of newspapers are these? And it turns out it was all put out by a Maoist organization, and they had pictures of Mao on it. So I spent the night sleeping on Mao's hate song, and kept me warm for the night. But thank you very much for being here, I appreciate it, and support your library, yes?
Thank you. I was saying thanks.
Yeah,
Oh, yes, that's, well, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and if this is going to be recorded, if you could send me a link to it, because the publisher wants to know about these events, and I want, we'll have it posted on his site as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming over, Nick, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.